This morning, we're going to talk about forgiveness. Forgiveness is something that's easy to talk about, and yet many times hard to practice. We see Jesus' example of forgiveness dying on the cross. As they're nailing him into the cross and standing the cross up, Jesus says, "Father, forgive them." We've heard the story. We see Jesus teaching about forgiveness, and we talk about those teachings often. We encourage one another to forgive others on a regular basis. But when we are the one needing to extend forgiveness, that's a different story, because now it's personal. The religious leaders of Jesus' day were always trying to corner him. The Sadducees, on one particular occasion, came to Jesus and they asked him a particular question, and they thought, aha, we've got him trapped. Jesus gave a very wise answer, of course, and they felt a little foolish, kind of like a dog running away with their tail tucked between their legs. The Pharisees just happened to be there, the opposition, and they said, aha, the Sadducees look foolish. Let us show how good we are. And so they turned to Jesus and they asked him a question. They said, Jesus, which of the 10 commandments is the most important? What's he going to say? And so Jesus responds in Matthew 22 and he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. Jesus refers to the Old Testament, quotes the Old Testament. Make God number one. That's the first thing. And then he goes on and says the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So Jesus refers to the 10 commandments. He really does. The first 4 of those commandments are our relationship to God. Jesus said, you shall love the Lord your God and make him first. There it is, the first 4. Then Jesus says the second is like it. You shall treat your neighbor as yourself. That's the last 6. Jesus refers specifically to the 10 commandments. And the greatest of these is the first 4. Jesus says putting God first is the most important thing in life. He has to be first. And today we take the same position, don't we? Jesus needs to be number one in our life. God has to be first in our lives. He needs to be more important than any possession, any talent, any gift, even any person. Jesus talks about the loving one another, the last 6 of the commandments. He says our priorities must be straight. Jesus points out that God must be first and man must be second. And so we seek to pattern our lives after Jesus, don't we? That's who we seek to emulate. And unfortunately, as sinners, we fail. Much more often than we would like in most cases. So we go back to ask God for forgiveness. However, we read in our passage today, Matthew 5:23, that if we are coming to ask God for forgiveness and we remember someone who we need to forgive, our relationship to man comes first. Now you might say, no, wait a second, you're talking out of both sides of your mouth, Pastor. You said God first, then man. Well, in this case, it's reversed. Man needs to come first. When it comes to forgiveness, man needs to come first. Jesus told a parable. A parable is a story with a point. And so Jesus, upon one of these teaching occasions, he's talking about a particular situation. There's a king who decides that it's time to make all the accounts right. And so he begins to look down the registry of the loans and the debts that are outstanding. And as he's looking through the list, up comes a particular debt of 10,000 talents. Now, 10,000 talents is enough to employ 10,000 workers for 18 years. Just to help you wrap your mind around what that might look like today, it's to the tune of $100 million. No surprise the king wanted to call this debt in. And so he calls the man and he says, here's your debt. I need you to pay up. And the man says, "Oh, king, I can't do it. I don't have that money right now." And the king says, "Well, then you and your family are all going to be sold. All your possessions are going to be sold. And I'm going to do whatever I have to get my money back." And the man falls before the king and says, "King, please have mercy on me. Just wait a little bit. Give me some time. I'll get it all back to you." It seems like an overwhelming debt. I mean, after all, if you were to be asked to pay $100 million, could you do it? If you could, I'd like to talk with you after the service. This man had an insurmountable debt, a debt he could not pay, and he fell before the king and said, "Please, have mercy on me." The Bible doesn't tell us what happened, but for some reason the king did have mercy on this man. The king was moved for some reason, and he said, "Okay, I'm going to wipe out that debt. $100 million gone just like that." Wow. What a celebration leaving that room before the king, right? I mean, that guy must have felt really good. Well, Jesus goes on with the story and says that this man leaves the presence of the king, and he goes out and he comes across a man that owes him 100 denarii. Now, this is enough to pay one worker for 100 days. Denarii is a day's wages. And so this particular man owes the man that's just been forgiven this great debt a rough equivalent of about $20,000. Now, that's nothing in comparison to $100 million, but $20,000 still isn't pocket change for most of us. And this man comes to the man that owes him $20,000. He says, "Hey, you need to pay me back. You need to do it now." And the guy says, "Well, I don't have the money right now. Just give me a little bit of time. I'll go and I'll get the money and I'll bring it back to you. I'll earn the money. I'll figure out a way to get it." The first man says, "No. You need to pay me now, and if you don't pay me, you're going to go to jail. Your family's going to go to jail. I'm going to sell all your stuff so I can get my money back." The man says, "Please, just have mercy on me. Give me a little bit of time." And the man says, "No way." And he throws him in jail. As you can imagine, the story gets back to the king. The king who just wiped out $100 million debt. Do you think the king was happy about that? No way. No way. I just wiped out this huge debt, and you're quibbling over pennies? What is your problem? And so the king takes the man and throws him in jail. Jesus told this story to make a point. But what's it have to do with you and I? It has a lot to do with us, you see, because Jesus is that king. You and I are the men that have to pay back that $100 million. And I don't know about you, but I know I couldn't pay that back in my lifetime. Forget, give me an extra month. It is an insurmountable debt. And that's what you and I owe to Jesus. Romans 6:23 tells us that our sin, the consequence of our sin is eternal separation from God, eternal death. There is nothing we can do, friends, to pay that debt. Jesus is the king, and he has wiped out that debt. It's as though our $100 million debt has been wiped out. We owe zero. That's amazing. And then how do we turn and treat our brothers and sisters? How do we treat those who sin against us? How do we treat them? Are we willing to forgive them no matter how heinous the crime may be? Because Jesus has forgiven you, no matter how heinous the crime has been. John writes about the importance of love in his first epistle. He talks about God's love for us. He talks about knowing God through love, seeing God through love. And then he brings it down to a practical level, which is something that I love. And he says in 1 John chapter 4, verse 20 and 21, if someone says, "I love God," and hates his brother, he is a what? Liar. That's pretty strong language, friends. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? And this commandment we have from him, that he who loves God must love his brother also. Pretty straightforward talk from Scripture, isn't it? How can we say we love God if we hold something against our brother or our sister? It doesn't say, if it's really bad, you can hold a grudge. If it's really bad, you don't have to forgive them. It doesn't say, well, you can be angry at them forever, just don't do anything about it. It says, how can we claim to love God if we hate our brother? Doesn't matter the crime. We can say whatever we want. Words are cheap, right? We can wear a mask. We can pretend like everything's fine. But is it? So John tells us, don't say one thing and do another. Let your actions back up your words. Follow God's commandments. Love God first. Put Him first. But love your brother a close second. Jesus was teaching His disciples to pray the famous prayer in Matthew chapter 6. We call it the Lord's Prayer. And after Jesus intimates those words that we recite as the Lord's Prayer, He goes on and He says this, if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. So there's a little equation here. If you do, then I will do. If you do not do, then I will not do. If you forgive, you will be forgiven, just like the story Jesus told, the story about the king. If we are unwilling to forgive those who have sinned against us, God says, you're withholding my forgiveness from you. That's pretty serious. Sometimes we don't think about it. We think, well, God's just always going to forgive me no matter what. God is always willing to forgive us. But there are times that we stand in the way. It's not that God isn't willing. It's that we have caused a problem, that we are unwilling to forgive. Giving forgiveness is spoken of as a prerequisite to receiving forgiveness. Another time, Jesus was teaching His disciples. This is not just another time of telling the same story in a different gospel. This was another event. And Jesus is teaching, and He tells His disciples in Mark chapter 11, whenever you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, forgive him, that your Father in heaven may also forgive your trespasses. Same thing again. Jesus says in order to receive forgiveness, you must give forgiveness. If you want to be right with me, Jesus says, you need to be right with your brothers. We can't have division in the church family, in our spiritual family. We need to be right with one another. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to be chummy and want to go to everybody's events. Okay? We still have our preferences. There may be someone that I choose to love who I don't choose to associate with. See, there's a difference. If I can want their well-being, if I can want the Lord to bless them, if I can pray that the Lord will bless them, I've made a decision to love that person. I may not want to go to their party. I may not want to get a ride with them to go somewhere. I may not want to do things socially with them. But I still want God to bless them. God says we need to forgive one another, to love one another. We're called to forgive our brothers and sisters. And living out a Christ-like life is more important than practicing forms of religion. Let me say that again. Living out a Christ-like life is more important than practicing forms of religion. And maybe you say, well, wait a second, Pastor. You're not supposed to say things like that. You want us all in church, don't you? Yeah. But God sees through the facade you wear here. Being here means nothing to salvation. It's what's in here. Because you see, we're good at wearing masks. Some of you aren't doing too well today. But when somebody says, hey, how's it going? You say, oh, just fine. Now, there's a place and a time to be real and authentic. Paul tells us in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. He says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. You see, it's not about what we wear on the outside. We can do all the religious things. We can go to church. We can give our tithe. We can do good things for others. And yet we can be lost. Because if we aren't willing to extend forgiveness to our brothers and sisters, forgiveness is withheld from us as well. That sin stands in the way of our relationship with our Heavenly Father. Stands in the way of the only hope that we have of salvation. We are to be crucified with Christ. We are to let Him live in and through us. So we don't live by the standards of this world, holding grudges and getting even, no matter how much we might want to. And believe me, I've been there. I've experienced anger that I didn't know existed in my being. I know what it is to be mad. And I know what it is to extend forgiveness when it's not deserved. I'm no saint, don't get me wrong. Maybe you've been there too. It's hard to do, and sometimes we feel like we punish others by withholding forgiveness. But you know, the reality is we only hurt ourselves. We don't hurt anybody else by withholding forgiveness. We only hurt ourselves. We hurt ourselves physically. We hurt ourselves spiritually because we've built a barricade between us and God. And we hurt ourselves more than anybody else. Paul tells the young Timothy about the days just before Jesus comes. This time not talking about the signs as Robin had referred to, but Paul says to Timothy, "For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving." And he goes on and on and on with this list of things that people will do in the last days. And then he says, "Having a form of godliness, but denying its power." Having a form of godliness, doing the right things, but denying the saving grace and the power of Jesus Christ inside. This is what it will be like in the last days. A form of godliness. We must not be like the world around us. We need to give up the right to become angry, to get even, to hold grudges, and to withhold forgiveness. Remember, Christ has forgiven you more than you could ever hope to repay. Why would you withhold from someone else? We are called not to be conformed to this world. Paul tells the Romans in Romans 12, 1 and 2. He says, "Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed." And how? By the renewing of your mind. Give yourself the right to forgive others when they don't deserve it. Give them what they don't deserve. Be willing to extend forgiveness. Because we are to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. So we're called to forgive one another when someone has sinned against you. Jesus gives a principle in Matthew chapter 18 that I think we would do well to heed. It's something far too often we overlook. We don't pay attention to. Maybe we've read it before, but it went in one eye and out the other ear. We've read it time after time, but how often do we practice it? The Matthew 18 principle to dealing with sin. Jesus says the first step, if your brother has sinned against you, is to go to your brother and talk to him. See if you can work it out. That is the best way, hands down, to dealing with controversy. Face to face, one-on-one. But you know, we're really good at doing it a different way. You know what way I'm talking about, right? We like to find people that agree with us that person is a bad person. They've wronged us. They've hurt our ministry, whatever it is. We sure like to get people on our side. And then we have a case. We've built a case. Now we can go blast this person for how terrible they are. But Jesus says, no, that's not the way to do it. You go one-on-one. You say, hey, there's a problem here. We've got a problem. We've got to get this figured out. Now, there are some things that we need to bring to others' attention when we've broken biblical standards. But then there are other times that we simply need to forgive someone in our hearts. Maybe something they said offended us. for whatever reason. Maybe sometimes we just need to, in our own hearts, say, Lord, help me to forgive this person. Maybe they didn't know what they said. You know, sometimes we say things meaning the very best, and we really get it wrong. And sometimes we need to extend forgiveness to people who've been offended by us. Or who have offended us, rather, because we don't know where they're coming from. Maybe it was a bad day. Maybe they didn't mean anything by what they said. Maybe just in our hearts, we need to offer forgiveness to that individual. Ellen White, one of my favorite authors, comments and says about this particular idea. Did I get it? Oh, sorry, I'm having a little... Yeah. All right. So Ellen White says about this concept of forgiving someone, about dealing with one-on-one. She says, if your sin is between you and God, you need not to bring publicity to it. Sometimes we're good at blabbing our dirty laundry, right? But confess it to God, she says. Often poor, weak mortals act very unadvisedly in the matter of confessing their sins to human beings. There's times when we have committed sin and we know we have committed sin, but there is no need to share with anybody else. Sometimes we simply need to take that matter before the Lord and say, God, please forgive me. Help me not to do this again. Help me not to act this way again. Help me not to say these things again. Help me not to think these things. Whatever it is, Lord, please forgive me. So sometimes it's a matter that we simply need to take to God. Jesus goes on in this principle, if you've taken it one-on-one and there's no resolution, bring a third party. Because you know there's wisdom in some outside perspective, right? Sometimes when we have conversations, they kind of go like this. You see, I'm talking on this level and you're talking on this level, and we're never going to intersect because we don't get it. I know what I'm talking about, you know what you're talking about, but we are not on the same page. And that third person says, oh, wait a second. Oh. Third party is a good way to do it. Bring some additional light to that conversation, and Jesus knows that. And he says, so take a third party with you. And he says, if you still can't figure it out, if the erring one still doesn't recognize their sin, how they've broken God's law, take it to the church. That's pretty serious business. Now, friends, this morning I'm not suggesting that we start an inquisition. I'm not saying that. This principle is to be used on a personal level. We need to make things right between our brothers and sisters. We need to not hold grudges. We need to do it not only for for the well-being of our church family, but for our own health. You know somebody who's got a chip on their shoulder, they've got a grudge, and they've just kind of become really bitter. And you just kind of don't like to talk to this person anymore? That bitterness, that unwillingness to extend forgiveness has rotted them from the inside out. And the Lord knows this, and he says that's why we need to extend forgiveness. We need to get beyond ourselves. We need to offer that forgiveness. If we hold grudges, eventually they will overflow, and there will be great damage. Referring to our scripture reading today, Ellen White comments and says, here it is, our gifts, our prayers are not acceptable to God while we leave this duty, this would be forgiveness to others, as we leave this duty undone and let the poison of envy, evil surmising, and jealousy take possession of our souls and spoil our union and happiness. Oh, how much unhappiness would be spared and how many evil thoughts would be quenched if believers would take up the work that Christ has said must be done to prevent evil thinking and evil speaking. What damage is done when we do not offer forgiveness to each other. We must be right with each other to be right with God. Again, Ellen White says, right believing means right doing. Christ gave his life to make it possible for you to be a partaker of the divine nature. Remember that the Lord will bless all who put their trust in him. When we are willing to step aside and say, yes, this person wronged me. Yes, it hurt tremendously. And yes, I'm going to offer forgiveness to them. Even though I don't want to. Even though it makes no logical sense to me at all. This is not the way we do these things. I'm going to trust God. I'm going to believe that when he tells me that I need to forgive others, he means it. And that it is actually for my benefit. I am going to offer forgiveness. Now, that doesn't mean all the ill will just disappears like that. Sometimes it may take continual pleading with God to help us. But we are called to offer forgiveness to our brothers and sisters today. So today, as we celebrate the communion service together, let's make sure our hearts are right.